Hello, boys and girls. Welcome to Storytime Fun. We hope you enjoy. Today's story is out of the Walt Disney's Storyland book. And the name of our story for today is called Dumbo of the Circus. Today you're going to hear part 1. There's going to be 3 parts to this exciting story. Suggested by the story Dumbo the Flying Elephant by Helen Aberson and Harold Pearl. The circus animals paced back and forth in their cages nervously. They sniffed at the air for the first smells of spring and peered at the skies anxiously. Everyone in the circus was eager for spring to come. After long months at the winter quarters in Florida, the clowns, the ringmaster, the musicians, the acrobats, and the animal trainers were all restless. The trapeze artists were limbering up their muscles for their daredevil tricks. The circus train's locomotive, Casey Jr., was exercising his piston rods, and the Calliope was practicing a few toots on his pipes. Before long, Casey Jr. would take the circus on the tour. Yay! They all stopped occasionally to look at the sky. They were expecting something. Finally it came. A great flock of storks. Wow! Carrying big bundles in their beaks. The messenger birds zoomed low over the circus and dropped their packages. Wow! Parachutes blossomed forth, and the eagerly awaited bundles floated gently to the earth. When each bundle had been delivered safely, the circus animals were so happy. Leo the lion and his wife had 4 of the cutest little cubs anyone had ever seen. Mrs. Chimpanzee had a baby chimpanzee to dandle on her knees. There was a tiny hippopotamus weighing only 300 pounds. An infant seal had come as long as your hand and as bright as a cricket. Ooh! There was a baby tiger who loved to have his mother, Mrs. Tiger, polish his fur with her clean, soft tongue. And 2 miniature zebras had come, complete with stripes. Yay! But for Mrs. Jumbo, the elephant, who had been waiting so patiently, there was nothing. She scanned the sky for one of the messenger birds. As she waited, Mrs. Jumbo stamped nervously in her stall. Her elephant friends tried to comfort her as much as possible, but it was difficult, for they were almost as disappointed as she was. "Maybe the messenger's just a little late," one of the elephants said to Mrs. Jumbo. "Even a baby elephant is a heavy bundle for a stork, you know." Mrs. Jumbo did not give up hope until the circus train pulled up on the loading platform and the animals marched into their cars. It was a happy time for everyone but the elephants. They did not want to go on the tour without a baby elephant. Casey Jr., the circus train locomotive, was not worrying about the baby elephants. He blinked his lamps and stretched his piston rods to get the cramps out of them, blew the rust out of the whistle and a few experimental smoke rings out of his stack, and looked back to see how far the loading of the circus train had progressed. He whistled impatiently and shot a hiss of steam from his boiler to let everyone know he was ready. Yay! "All aboard!" called the circus boss. All aboard, whistled Casey as he crouched low, pushed his wheels against the tracks, and pulled forward. The cars jerked into movement, and behind him he puffed away from the winter quarters, gaining speed and rolling along more and more easily. Casey Jr. let out a long, high whistle. It was good to feel the cool, fresh air rushing past him as he sped northward. He tooted a greeting to some birds who flew alongside him. He whistled to the cows in the field, who looked up and mooed to him, as they did every spring when Casey Jr. passed. As he rattled across the plains, the young colts in the pastures challenged him to races. Oh, Casey Jr. purposely slowed down to let them beat him in order not to hurt their feelings. This pleased the colts' mothers, who looked on proudly and decided that Casey Jr. was a grand fellow. On and on, the little locomotive chugged, chook, 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 tooting at steamboats when he ran alongside rivers and at factories when he passed through cities. They whistled back, for they were all old friends of Casey Jr. Casey had serious responsibilities, too. In the mountains, when he saw a tunnel ahead, he had to toot a warning to the giraffes to pull their necks down. Yikes! And there was one particular long, dark tunnel where he wasn't exactly afraid, but it somehow kept up his courage to whistle to himself a little. In the train behind him, clowns sang in time to the clickety-clack of the wheels, and the animals rocked their babies to sleep with the swaying motion of their cars. But in the elephant car, Mrs. Jumbo stayed alone in her compartment, and her friends stood together without chattering and gossiping as they usually did. Mrs. Jumbo would have been much happier if she had known who was sitting on a cloud just not too far away. It was a special delivery stork. He had detoured around a bad thunderstorm and had lost his way. But there he was at last, on the trail of Mrs. Jumbo. Far below, he could see the circus train crawling along the country. "Look out below!" he cried as he picked up his bundle and descended in the power drive. "Mrs. Jumbo! Where's Mrs. Jumbo?" he called as he came up to the two giraffes, who pointed to the elephant cart just ahead. "Oh, Mrs. Jumbo!" sang the stork. "In here!" cried the elephants. "In here! This way, please!" The stork flew through the opening in the roof into the car where Mrs. Jumbo was so eagerly waiting for him. Yay! "Mrs. Jumbo," the stork said, tipping his cap politely and putting his bundle on the floor beside him. Mrs. Jumbo stared at once and started to untie, but the messenger insisted that Mrs. Jumbo sign the receipt for one elephant before she opened the package. Then he tipped his hat and flew away, as all the other elephants gathered around so excitedly. "Quick, open the bundle, Mrs. Jumbo!" cried one of the other elephants. "I'm on pins and needles," cooed another one. "This is a proud day for us elephants," said a third. And when Mrs. Jumbo's trembling trunk had at last unfastened the bundle, there lay a little elephant, all curled up, fast asleep. "Isn't he a darling?" cooed one of the elephants to the others. "Just too sweet for words," said another. Mrs. Jumbo just beamed at the little fellow. "What are you going to name him?" asked the first elephant. "Little Jumbo," said the mother proudly. "Coochie, coochie, coochie, coo," went one of the elephants as she tickled the baby playfully. That made him sneeze. Achoo! And when the baby sneezed, his ears, which had been hidden, flapped forward. The elephants jumped back in amazement. Those were the most enormous ears anyone had ever seen on an elephant. They were larger by far than the ears on all the grown-up elephants. They could not help staring at the baby elephant. Even Mrs. Jumbo looked a little startled and amazed. The baby elephant looked up and smiled. His ears dropped back down again and dragged on the floor. One of the big elephants tittered. "Isn't he silly looking?" she whispered to the elephant next to her, but in a whisper so loud that everyone heard. "Simply ridiculous," said the other. "Why, he's just a freak elephant, that's all." Mrs. Jumbo glared at them and beamed at her baby. When he grew into those ears, he would be the biggest and most magnificent elephant in the world. "I think you'd better change his name," said the oldest elephant, trying to make her voice sound especially sweet. "Jumbo won't quite fit. I think Dumbo is what you mean." All the other elephants giggled and laughed merrily over this clever joke, but Mrs. Jumbo could stand it no longer. She slammed her compartment door in their faces. Through the walls, the mother elephants heard the other laughing and joking. She lay down and took her little baby in her arms, caressing him gently with her trunk. The baby elephant had made contented noises and gradually fell asleep. Everyone in the circus called the baby elephant Dumbo. His big ears became the great joke of the circus. Every time the train went through a tunnel, a clown said he hoped Dumbo hadn't pulled his ears in first. When the wind blew strongly, the big elephants tried to act worried, saying that if the winds caught Dumbo's ears, it would pick up the whole train and blow it away. Dumbo just smiled when they heard these things. He was just a little bewildered that others were not more friendly with him. He even laughed at some of the jokes of himself. He thought that the idea of flying away in the wind was fine. It sounded like fun to him. Mrs. Jumbo stayed in her own compartment almost all the time and kept the little Dumbo with her. Her temper grew worse, and she began to brood and worry, and it's not good for elephants to brood and worry. An evening finally came when everyone forgot about Dumbo. That was when Casey Jr. puffed wearily to a stop in the city where the first show was to be given. Yay! It had been a long pull for Casey Jr., but despite his fatigue, he was excited too. Even the storm that was raging could not dampen the spirits of the members of the circus. They set to work in the driving rain to raise the tents and get everything ready for the first show, which was to be given the very next day. The roustabouts opened the doors of the freight cars and began to unload the tents and the ropes. The animal keepers let out the elephants and set them to work. The big animals lifted the tents and poles up with their trunks a lot. They pushed the circus wagons off the flat cars and pulled the heavy loads that the men could not possibly handle. And all the time they worked, the rain poured down on them and the thunder boomed so loudly. When the lightning flashed, Dumbo could see short glimpses of the hurried work going on all around him. When the thunder rumbled, he just grasped his mother's tail a little more firmly and kept on trudging behind her. Wherever she went, lifting, pulling, and hauling, he tagged along. As the sun rose in the morning, the clouds were chased from the sky by a fresh wind, and in the open field the circus, all set and ready for the first show, glistened in the bright morning light. After breakfast, everyone got ready for the big parade. The clowns put on their wigs and makeup and costumes. The horses were brushed until they shone. The bright ribbons were put on their manes and tails. The animals were marched into their cage wagons, and the elephants got in line, tail and trunk, tail and trunk. The Calliope brought up the rear, his shining pipes uttering the little toots of impatience. This first parade of the season was lighted, the children lining the streets delighted everyone. Finally, the parade began. Bright flags were flying, and the hundreds of cheering people lined the streets. Boys and girls, men and women, grandmothers and grandfathers, and babies in their mothers' arms were all there, cheering as the beautiful white horses appeared at the head of the parade. Everyone cried with pleasure as the well-trained animals pranced and reared back so gracefully. Next came the first group of clowns, jumping and leaping and running in circles. Then the big cage wagons with the wild animals rolled into view, followed up by more clowns in song of the Calliope, and they knew that the end of the circus was approaching. But first, down the center of the street, they kept perfect step as they walked along, each elephant holding with his trunk the tail of the elephant in front of him. At the very end of the line came Dumbo. He had a hard time reaching up with his little trunk to the tail of his mother in front of him, and he could not keep step no matter how hard he tried. At first glance, people thought Dumbo was cute, but then they saw his floppy ears dragging on the ground, and they tittered and they giggled. And some laughed out loud. The people laughed at Dumbo more than they had at the monkeys or the clowns. Monkeys and clowns are supposed to be laughed at, but elephants are dignified and majestic creatures. You can say, "Oh," or "Ah," or "How big," or "How strong" about an elephant, but you can't just laugh at him. Poor Mrs. Jumbo's ears burned to hear all the laughing over her little son. She glared furiously at the people on the sidewalks. She was glad when the parade was ended. She did not know that even worse was in store for her and for Dumbo. Back in the tent, Mrs. Jumbo gave Dumbo a bath so that he would look fine for the first show that afternoon. She scrubbed him with his trunk until he laughed and said it tickled. He splashed in the tub and made his own shower bath by taking water in his own trunk and spouting it into the air over him. When Mrs. Jumbo had carefully wrung out Dumbo's big ears and he had shaken himself dry, they ate their lunch and then went to their stalls in the menagerie. The other animals had taken their places. The performers were all ready, and the ringmaster had shined up his black top hat. Outside the big tent, the barkers were shouting to the first of the crowd, telling of the wonderful sights to be seen inside. There was the fat lady, the thin man, the Stretcho, the India rubber man, the man who swallowed sharp swords, eeks, the man who ate fire, wow, the lions, the tigers, the acrobats, the clowns, and the elephants. Soon the crowd was streaming through the tents. A group of boys gathered near the rope in front of Mrs. Jumbo's stall. They pointed at Dumbo and laughed. Dumbo, trying to be friendly, walked toward them. But at the very first step, he tripped on one ear and rolled on the ground. Oh, the little boys roared with laughter, and a bigger crowd gathered. "What a wonderful sailboat he'd make!" yelled one boy. Oh, another boy opened his coat and held it far out from his body. "Look, here's Dumbo," he cried as he wiggled his coat, and everyone laughed. Oh, Mrs. Jumbo could stand it no more. She reached out quickly and grabbed one boy who had just been sticking out his tongue at Dumbo. Then she spanked him soundly. The other boys screamed and ran away, and the keepers came running as fast as they could. "Wild elephant!" someone yelled, and the crowd began to run for the exits. Oh, when the first of the animal keepers tried to push Mrs. Jumbo back into the corner of her stall, she picked him up with her trunk and tossed him into a pile of hay. The ringmaster came with a whip, and Mrs. Jumbo threw him in the big tub of water. More keepers came running with their long spiked poles. They poked Mrs. Jumbo, trying to force her back into her stall where they could tie her fast. But now the mother elephant knew that they wanted to lock her up away from her Dumbo. She lifted her trunk and bellowed loudly. She knocked down the keepers in front of her, but a man slipped behind her. Oh dear, and quickly put a chain around her rear leg. Then another man rushed forward and bound her. "Take her to the prison car!" cried the dripping ringmaster. "She's dangerous!" So Mrs. Jumbo was led away to prison, and Dumbo was left all alone. Poor Dumbo. He didn't have anybody at all. That night, in the elephant tent, all the big animals were gathered around a pile of hay for dinner. They were busy eating and talking about the terrible things that had happened that day. "I used to think he was funny," one of them said, "but now I think he's a disgrace. Mrs. Jumbo was a fine, decent, and respectful elephant until he came along." "Dumbo is not just a disgrace to his mother," another said. "He's a disgrace to all elephants in the world all over." On the other side of the pile of hay was a very tiny creature who listened wonderingly to all the conversations. It was Timothy, the circus mouse. He had smoothed out a comfortable place for himself and was lying there wondering how soon he could step out and scare the elephants. As long as he lived, he never stopped getting a thrill out of scaring elephants. Whoever it was that arranged things so that elephants were frightened of little mice had such a great idea. When Timothy was feeling a little blue, whenever he had a bad day, he could always make himself feel fine and important again just by scaring a bunch of elephants. But today, Timothy cocked his head on one side and listened carefully to the chatter of the big animals. Ordinarily, the elephants didn't talk much while they were eating. Now they muttered and whispered in shocked tones, and Timothy guessed that they were really enjoying the whole affair, even though they pretended to be horrified. Something exciting had happened. Anyway, Timothy concluded. Too bad he had missed it. Whatever it was, it must have occurred while he was away searching for furniture for the new house he was building under the floor of the ringmaster's car. And that's where we're going to end it today. But stay tuned for part 2 of the Dumbo story. That's it for today. We'll see you next time.